Yeah, hi everybody. My name is Jamie Davidson, and I'm the president of SUPR, or Students United for Palestinian Rights. We're a group of intersectional activists working to draw connections between the colonial project in Palestine and other systems of oppression in America and abroad. And this year we've been hosting a lecture series, which we're calling Opposing the Institution, which draws connections between the military-industrial complex and colonial state building projects. And all of our lectures from this series are available on or most of our lectures are available on our YouTube channel, which I will share. And in the face of such interconnected systems of oppression, Super believes that our true power comes from solidarity. So tonight, I believe I can speak on behalf of all of our Super members when I say that we're very happy to be co-hosting another event with BSA, whose work continues to make huge waves on our campus and inspire us in our advocacy. So Sharon, you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, hey everybody. My name is Sharon Reed Davis. I'm the president of BSA. Yeah, we're excited to be having this event with you guys as well. I know last time it was really successful and a lot of people learned a lot of different things. And one reason that we just wanted to have this event during Black Love Week. Okay, sorry. I'm playing my audio in my AirPods too because I would just want to make sure I have my phone ready just in case my laptop start messing up, which it has a habit of doing, but it's distracting me, so I'm gonna take those. But yeah, one reason we wanted to do this event during Black Love Week just because it's our responsibility like as black people to reach out and help advocate for other marginalized communities, and that's a part of Black Love. This semester we want to focus on community building, and these marginalized groups, these other groups aside from us, face the same struggles as we do, and this is part of community building. We have to reach out to get people to come in as well. So we just wanted to have this event. I hope you guys really like it. And with that, I'm gonna let Krishna take it away.
Thank you. And peace, everybody. Very happy to be here with you this evening. And just grateful that you're all here in the context of the moment that we're in, and just navigating the pandemic and school over Zoom. So strength and solidarity to all of you for doing what I can only imagine is one of the most difficult things you've ever done. And thank you to SUPR and the BSA for having me. You two are two of my favorite student groups anywhere, and I love this collaboration. The last talk I gave that you two co-hosted a few years ago was one of my all-time favorite events I've ever spoken at, in part due to the level of depth and conversation that we were able to get into, which I hope that we can continue today. I'll be doing a few rounds of intros. The first is just my general kind of bio. My name is Christian Davis Bailey. I am based in Chicago, where I currently work as the communications director at Palestine Legal, even though today's talk is in my independent capacity. As a student, I learned about Palestine during my sophomore year at Stanford, where I joined and eventually led Students for Justice in Palestine. After graduating, I did a lot of freelance writing that focused on the intersections of the movement for Black lives or Black liberation and the movement for Palestinian liberation, eventually co-founding an organization called Black for Palestine. My work has taken me all around the country and all around the world, building connections with different social movements, all the way from Hawaii to Brazil to Morocco to Lebanon, Palestine, and South Africa. And these are just some of the movements that I want to name and bring into the space today. And I meant to include Detroit in that list because I lived there for about 4 years, and it's a site of community, Black community and Black struggle that's very near and dear to my heart, and that you'll be hearing a decent amount about today. So I'll give you just an overview of kind of where I'm headed with my remarks, and then we can get into it. So I'll start with a little bit of just kind of structural grounding of the conversation around Black liberation and Palestinian. Okay, can you all see that? Cool. Okay, so if I was doing this workshop in person, we would probably break out into small groups if there were a lot of people, or have this conversation in a full group. So I'm going to try to facilitate this digitally today. But I like to ground us in a question that was posed by a mentor of mine, the late Dr. Vincent Harding, who was a Black revolutionary intellectual, famously responsible for drafting King's speech against the Vietnam War in 1967, in which he opposed racism, militarism, and materialism, but which we can call capitalism today. And I had the privilege of meeting Dr. Harding and his wife Aljosi when I was in Detroit for the first time in the summer of 2013. And Dr. Harding actually is one of the first people who encouraged me to speak up in support of Palestinian freedom. He had been to Palestine the year before in a delegation of civil rights and human rights leaders, and encouraged me to speak up even in the face of backlash from people who either don't understand what I'm trying to say or who are actively opposed to what I'm trying to say. And so I bring him into the space today. But Dr. Harding, when he encountered a group of people, would ask them to introduce themselves in a way that grounded them in where they were born, and in the land of their mother's mother. And so what I'd like to invite you to do by chat, or rather in person, he would ask you to introduce yourself by your full name and where you were born, and then the full name of your mother's mother and where she was born. For the sake of brevity and also respecting people's privacy here, we can leave names out of it. But what I'd like to invite you to do is just drop in the chat where you were born and where your mother's mother was born, or somebody who fills the figure of a grandmother in your life. And while folks are doing that, I'll just share that my name is Christian Bailey. I was born in New York City, and my grandmother, Rena, was born in North Carolina in the 1930s. And I'll just take a look at the chat to see where others are coming from. Detroit and the Philippines, nice. I have a good friend who's Filipino from Detroit. I see Baltimore and Tennessee, Livonia, Nigeria, Naperville and Chicago, Pontiac and Al Khalil, Palestine. I think that might be another Detroit, Philippines, Royal Oak and Detroit, Ann Arbor, New Orleans, Germany, Littleton, Colorado, and Flint, Michigan. Somebody has a twin, so same thing. Detroit and Georgia, Jackson, Mississippi and Saginaw, Southfield and Detroit, Harrisburg, Pennsylvania and Lancaster, Pennsylvania, Chicago and Plymouth, Washington State and Mexico City. I'm seeing lots of Detroit and Deep South connections here, Detroit and Alabama, Jamaica and Georgia, Illinois and North Korea, Royal Oak and Alabama. So if you want to introduce yourself and haven't yet, feel free to do so. But I like to use this activity, and Dr. Harding uses this activity for us to really ground ourselves in the land in which we come from, and in the struggles of those who came before us. And I only see a handful of folks on video, that's okay. But if you are able to, either in your reactions or with a thumbs up, just indicate if you or your family comes from a community that has endured or experienced racism or colonialism. Can you put your hand up in some kind of way? And you can even just put that in the chat, like, yes, that's me, or something like that. Thank you. Now, can you put your hand up if your community has experienced justice, what you would call justice, for the racism or colonialism that your community experienced? And if anyone feels they have, feel free to put that in the chat. But I am going to wager that most, if not all of us, have experienced justice for the historical and ongoing violence that we're experiencing. And that's what brings us here today to talk about Black and Palestinian liberation. So I'll go back to sharing my slides. Okay, so there's a few things I want to offer as grounding. that the reality in which we live and are discussing today is the result of the dreams and nightmares, largely of the imagination of Europe. So the fact that we're sitting on Turtle Island and the indigenous people primarily are not here and are not governing their own land in ways that suit their lifestyles, everything from the names of the roads to the fact that the roads are here to just the corporations that exist to the way our school system is designed. All of this is coming out of a certain imagination or vision of the world, primarily from the descendants of European settlers. This is the same situation when we talk about Palestine. And what I mean by that, to be very clear, is that we are all currently sitting on stolen land in a country that exists due to the genocide and land theft of hundreds of indigenous nations, as well as the enslavement and exploitation of enslaved Africans and their descendants. In addition to generations of migrants from various countries who have been exploited to build this country's railroads, highways, infrastructure, and are often discarded after they serve their purpose. And I could pull up a very similar map that shows you the transformation of Palestinian land from being fully under Palestinian control to Palestinians today only having access to 22% of their historic land, with the rest either directly annexed by Israel or occupied by Israel. And what I'd like to offer as a framework for this discussion is the notion of repair. We've talked a lot about reparations, or it's been very popular in the last year or so, but really want to focus on the word within that, which is repair, and the need to obtain justice for very deep and serious harms and legacies of violence that all of our communities have experienced. And so the struggle for Black liberation is a struggle to repair over 5 centuries of racial violence. The struggle for Palestinian liberation is a struggle to repair about a little over a century of colonization of their land and occupation of their land. And so I want us to think as we engage in this conversation, what does repair look like for our communities? As I've stated, we're not only sitting on colonized territory, but the United States and Europe themselves are the only way they can exist in the way that they do today is due to the plundering of wealth, resources, land, and even people from the global South, from Africa, from the Americas, from Asia. And that the struggle for Palestinian liberation in the context of Palestine and Israel are part of this broader legacy of European colonialism. The Zionist movement to colonize Palestine originated in Europe and was primarily driven by European people of Jewish descent. If there's one thing you take away from what I speak about Palestine today, it's that occupation is not the core of the struggle or the issue. It's certainly a very important aspect of justice for Palestine, but the primary issue is the forced exile and dispossession of Palestinians from their land between 1947 and 1967, when Israel was founded. And what I mean by this is, I'm sorry I don't have a map today, but based on the way that Israel was founded and how it operates and continues to operate, any Jewish person, such as Anna here in this picture on the left, can move to Israel and obtain citizenship. But the vast majority of Palestinians in the world who are from that same land cannot return to live there, precisely because they're not Jewish. And so in 1948, when Israel was founded, about 75% of the indigenous Palestinian population was either expelled directly by Zionist militias, or they fled due to the war that was going on in their land and seeking safety. And after Israel was founded, it prevented, permanently banned these refugees from returning back to their homes in a state that was then or now called Israel. And so today there are over 7 million Palestinian refugees. And these refugees actually comprise the majority of the global Palestinian population. So Palestinians that live in the West Bank or Gaza are under occupation, while they are a few million, maybe 4 or 5 million people, are actually not a majority of the Palestinian people of the world. The majority of Palestinians in the world are refugees who are not allowed to return to their homes in what is now Israel. And I'm going to be centering on the need to speak up for the refugees and their right to return to their homes a lot during this talk. The last thing that I hope is clear is that divide and conquer and siding with systems of oppression actually keeps us all oppressed. So I want to be very clear to acknowledge the centuries, if not millennia old history of anti-Semitism and racism and violence against Jewish people, primarily in Europe, but also around the world. And to note that for many, the state of Israel as a form of repair or reparations, specifically for the crimes of the Holocaust, the Nazi Holocaust in the 1930s and 40s. And in my analysis of, not just my analysis, but in the analysis of internationalists, of socialists, of Pan-Africanists, of revolutionaries, there are choices in how we obtain our freedom and our liberation. We can either side with and fight alongside the other oppressed people of the world, or we can align ourselves with the states that represent the interest of empire, of money, of greed, to get some benefits for our own safety and security and our own safety and security alone. And so in this context, Israel has sided, and from its existence has sided with the imperial powers of the world, the United States, England, and France primarily. But these are countries that whose histories of colonialism impact practically all of us in this conversation today. And so we can't simply seek justice or freedom for our own community, especially if it's at the expense or actively contributing to the oppression of another population. So that's something that I hope we can all kind of take away when we're talking about the struggle for Palestinian freedom. And again, just to drive it home, the United States and Israel are both settler colonies. That means that people who were not from the land, primarily from Europe, immigrated to territories that were not theirs, and then instituted social, economic, and cultural systems of domination over indigenous and other oppressed populations. And so just the issues that we see with borders and immigration today are artificial, because the borders do not really exist in the way that they do today across the Americas. This is the same context for what is quote unquote the Middle East, where we now think of Palestinian other people, but that entire territory used to be very open with very porous borders. People had the ability to wake up in Jerusalem and have lunch in Beirut and then have dinner in Damascus. And today, not a single population from the region is able to visit, or most people from the region are not able to travel freely around the region. And this is largely due to the so-called Arab-Israeli conflict. So I want to ground us in really the last now 7 years, starting with the summer of 2014. And this is the summer where at the same time we saw Israel's last major assault on the Gaza Strip, in which over 2,000 people were killed by the military, and the murder of Mike Brown in Ferguson, Missouri, and the subsequent uprising of the Black population. Excuse me. And so it's during this summer that people began to make, or really our generation began to make new connections between the struggles for Black freedom and Palestinian liberation. The solidarity between these groups has existed for decades, but has gone through like kind of ebbs and flows. And the summer of 2014 represented a huge catalyst in bringing that solidarity back. So at the same time as we saw military style police occupy Ferguson and place Black folks under curfew and point military grade assault rifles at them and shoot tear gas at protesters, we also saw Israel's 51-day or 52-day bombardment of the Gaza Strip, in which many civilians were killed. And so people on the ground saw tanks in Ferguson and said, hey, this, like, where are we? Are we in Palestine right now? And we also saw Palestinians reach out over social media to offer advice on this is how you deal with tear gas if you're tear gassed in a protest, or stand closer to police shooting rubber bullets so that they actually can't impact you in the same kind of way. And we even saw that the tear gas that was used in Ferguson was made by a company in Pennsylvania, and it's the same tear gas that was used against protesters in Egypt and in Palestine. So there were very material connections that people were beginning to see between our conditions of oppression and struggle. Another thing that came up at this time was just the noting of police exchanges between police forces in the US and the Israeli military. And I believe it was the chief of police for St. Louis County had been on one of these so-called delegations to Israel prior to the uprising. So people began to see that their oppressors, or it's not even the direct oppressors, because police are only agents of an oppressive state, but that the agents who were employed to oppress them were training together and sharing skills in order to better facilitate the oppression of marginalized populations in the United States and in Israel, Palestine. So as a result of this, we saw a resurgence in Black Palestinian solidarity. We saw Black Lives Matter activists take a few different delegations to visit the occupied Palestinian territories. And in this shot are just a few of my favorite people, on one of the most emblematic examples of how apartheid plays out in the West Bank. So these activists are standing on Shuhada Street, which is the main street in the city of Hebron, which is the largest Palestinian city in the West Bank. And since 1994, this main street and the biggest Palestinian city in the West Bank has been closed to Palestinians due to the presence of about 800 Israeli settlers who are living there illegally under international law. So the military decided to close down the main road in order to, quote unquote, protect the lives of settlers who were squatting on stolen land. And so for anyone on this call who is not Palestinian, if you have an American passport, you are more than welcome to visit the West Bank, to visit Shuhada Street, and to walk back and forth across checkpoints without much harassment. But if you're Palestinian, specifically from the West Bank, you are not allowed to cross after a certain point in the street. And so this is what I want people to understand is one of the fundamental injustices Palestinians are facing, is that practically anyone from around the world who can visit their land and travel freely around it. But if you are from Palestine or from the broader region, Israel largely prevents you from moving freely across land that you were able to move freely across for centuries. And so I just want to underscore that at the height of the popularity of the Black Lives Matter movement and moment, they saw that it was important to extend solidarity to family and comrades under struggle in Palestine. A few years after this initial wave of delegations, the Movement for Black Lives issued a policy, they issued a policy statement endorsing what is called boycott, divestment, and sanctions, or BDS, for Palestinian freedom, which I'll speak about shortly, as well as calling Israel an apartheid state. And they face significant backlash for this position, but it's a position that I believe is just and correct. In the same moment, I was part of a group of Black organizers who drafted a statement to reiterate the long history of Black solidarity with Palestine. And this statement was signed by over 1,000 Black artists, activists, scholars, and students, including Angela Davis, Cornel West, Mumia Abu Jamal, and about a dozen other political prisoners of the United States, and specifically from the Black liberation struggle. So this is where Black for Palestine emerged, and we've been largely a loose network of activists around the country who care about internationalism, who care about international solidarity, and specifically who care about Palestine at the same time as we're doing work for our own community's liberation. So I want to jump back to this apartheid moment because I mentioned there was a lot of backlash against the movement for Black Lives over using the word apartheid to talk about Israel's actions against Palestinians. And part of what comes up when people hear the word apartheid is, but Israel is not what South Africa was. And Israel is not what South Africa was. But the point is that apartheid is actually a crime defined under international law. And its definition does not solely apply to what took place in South Africa. I'm not going to read all of this because the definition is quite long, but the crime of apartheid is modeled on practices and policies that took place in South Africa, but generally means inhumane acts committed for the purpose of establishing and maintaining domination by one racial group of persons over any other racial group of persons and systematically oppressing them. What does that systematic oppression look like? It means denying the right members of a racial group the right to life or liberty of person, by murder of members of a racial group, by subjecting them to torture or cruel, inhuman, and degrading treatment or punishment, by arbitrary arrest and illegal imprisonment. And I just want to pause here on this last piece because this question of illegal imprisonment is something that's very personal to me and some of my friends in Palestine. Let me just pull up their articles. So this is my friend Kifah, who a few years ago in 2017 was arrested without any charges or any trial and held for at least 6 months without trial by the Israeli military. And Kifah is one of hundreds of Palestinians who are held under what is called administrative detention, but which is more appropriately called indefinite detainment. So it's where Israel gets to say, based on security reasons, we need to hold you. We won't tell you why we're holding you. We won't tell your lawyers why we're holding you. We won't share any evidence we have against you, but you're a threat and we're holding you. And these periods of detainment last for 6 months and are renewable indefinitely. So Kifah was a student and still is a student at Birzeit University in the West Bank of Palestine. He's a progressive student who supports and stands in solidarity with struggles all around the world. And another friend who was arrested more recently is my friend Mace, who at the time was a 22-year-old journalism student at the same university in Palestine. She was also progressive, a leftist who supports the struggles for freedom of people around the world. And Israel also detained her, I think, for about 4 or 5 months without charging her, during which time they tortured her to the point where her family could not recognize her face when they went to visit her in the prison. Now, Mace was fortunately released about 2 or 3 months ago, but these are just 2 examples of literally hundreds of Palestinians, and specifically people who are the same age as you and me, who are students who support freedom and justice for their people and people around the world, who are arbitrarily arrested and illegally detained. So that's one condition of apartheid that Israel very easily meets. We can also talk about just the prevention of groups from participating in political, social, economic culture of the country, of denying people the right to organize or meet, denying people the right to leave and return to their country, freedom of movement and residence. So I wanted to see you all directly. There's a few things to say just on these pieces of information alone. So the first is that Israel's policy of indefinite detainment is not something that they came up with. It actually is a leftover from the British occupation of Palestine. I just want to be very clear that when I talk about Palestine and Israel as a European colonial project, I'm not just talking about European Zionists. I'm also talking about the British and their occupation of the Middle East and their collusion with the French to divide up the Middle East, to create states of Lebanon, Jordan, Syria, Iraq, Palestine, to say this is French territory, this is British territory. And even after the State of Israel was founded, I'm talking about the way in which the West, but specifically the United States, acts to prop up oppression, Israel's oppression of Palestinians. So the whole project is a project that fits into the broader history of European colonialism of land that does not belong to Europe. And on this question of the right to kind of assembly, one of the military laws that Palestinians are subject to under Israeli occupation is the denial of the ability, I think it's to have political meetings in groups of 10 or more people without permission from the military. I went to Stanford, and one of my classmates who's Palestinian was arrested under such a law. So if you don't allow the indigenous population to organize or to be political, that is a condition of apartheid. What I also want to say here, and I want to be very clear, South Africa was not the only apartheid state in the world. Israel is not the only active apartheid state at the moment. I would argue that the United States is and has always been an apartheid state based on its treatment of indigenous, Black, and other immigrant populations. And so when we look at the states that have ratified the International Convention about the Crime of Apartheid, who's been missing? The United States, Israel, and apartheid South Africa refused to sign it when they were an apartheid regime, precisely because each of these states would be open to prosecution under the crime of apartheid. So I'd like to speak briefly about boycotts, divestment, and sanctions, which is the current main way that Palestinians are asking for solidarity in their struggle for freedom. And this movement is modeled off of a similar campaign against apartheid in South Africa, where church groups, school groups, universities, just concerned citizens all around the world lobbied their governments both to remove money from the repressive apartheid South Africa regime, but also corporations that were facilitating acts of violence, encouraging divestment from those corporations. So this is a form of putting economic pressure on actors that were complicit in the harm of people in South Africa. And so in 2005, Palestinians put out a similar call for the world to put economic pressure on Israel in order to end three primary ways of oppression against Palestinians. One is ending the occupation of Palestinian land. Two is granting full legal citizenship for Palestinians who are citizens of Israel. Because since its inception, the Palestinians who stayed in what became Israel have been treated as second-class citizens under the law. And the third component is right of return for Palestinian refugees to be able to live in the lands where they came from. This movement, the BDS movement, emerged after decades of Palestinians trying various forms of struggle and solidarity for their freedom, and is just one aspect of the current struggle for freedom and ways to show solidarity with Palestinians. And so I'll talk a little bit about how this has played out in my own context as a student organizer. So this picture is from our Chicanic Student Center at Stanford. And this was after we had an event featuring two Palestinians from Birzeit University and the West Bank that were visiting the US to talk about how the occupation impacts their right to education. And so we literally had like hundreds of students show up. But this was in the midst of, this was after summer 2014. And we came back to campus and just everybody said, okay, well, Palestine, what can we do to support Palestine right now? The NAACP and the Black Student Union wanted to join a campaign. MECHA, the Chicana student organization, wanted to show up. And so what we wound up doing was launching a cross-campus multi-organization and community coalition called Stanford Out of Occupied Palestine. And this campaign was meant to pressure the university to divest from corporations complicit in human rights violations in Palestine. But because we were intersectional, we also focused on corporations that were complicit in the violence and abuse of other people in our country and around the world. So looking at companies that facilitated in the tracking and deportation of migrants along the US-Mexico border, or corporations that were complicit in the imprisonment and the god-awful prison system of the United States. And so it was through recognizing that many of the same entities that are facilitating oppression in Palestine are also harming people around the world that we were able to bring together a really massive coalition. And these are two other Palestinian students from the West Bank, three rather, visiting Ferguson and St. Louis just a few months after the uprising. And I will say that I organized the tour for these students, and I'll talk more about that later. So in the height of the Black Lives Matter moment, the Black students at Stanford, when they had the attention of the campus, said we cannot just focus on justice or liberation for Black people. We are also centering justice and liberation for Palestine in that context. So these pictures are from a shutdown that 68 Stanford students participated in on the San Mateo Bridge on MLK Day, 2015. And we not only protested the murder of Black people and Mike Brown and Eric Garner and others, but we also made sure that we center the struggle for Palestinian liberation in that context. And the police did not, we were Stanford students, so they didn't kind of rough us up, but it was still a very tense confrontation. And it really generated a lot of attention to the point where the media in the Bay Area could not ignore that the struggle for Palestinian freedom fits into King's legacy of opposing racism, militarism, and materialism. And so as a result of over 20 student organizations working together, this is from the Black Student Union to the American Indian Organization to Students for Queer Liberation to our Student and Labor Alliance organization, we were able to successfully pass a resolution in our student senate calling on Stanford to divest from corporations complicit in human rights violations in Palestine. And I just to give you the sense of how huge this moment was, I was part of Students for Justice in Palestine for 3 years, and our group had tried to pass divestment, I'd like to say for at least 10 years. And during our prior effort, we had 15 senators, student senators. One senator had voted in favor of divestment, and the majority had abstained, following lots of outside and external pressure from the Israeli government, the consulate in San Francisco, and other organizations. And just 2 years after that crushing defeat, the moment had changed and enough people had understood the core kind of injustice facing Palestinians that 10 out of 15 Stanford students who want to be the next Barack Obama and are afraid of kind of tarnishing their political careers felt that it was okay to vote in support of divestment from Palestinian oppression. So this is the power both of the moment that we've lived through over the last few years, but it's also the power of coalition building. So just in the remaining time, I want to speak a little bit more deeply on how we can support the Black struggle for liberation. Because last summer, after George Floyd's murder and the uprisings that began, we in Black for Palestine began to get a lot of questions from Palestinians, both in the US and abroad. How can we support your struggle? And so I just want to share a few thoughts from this. Each of these articles you can find on Electronic Intifada, and I will post them in the chat during the Q&A. So the first thing that I think is very crucial for us to understand is that the Black struggle is not simply a struggle against racism or for civil rights. It is a 500-year and more long struggle against colonialism and imperialism. And of the peoples of the world who have not experienced self-determination, Black people are one of them. We were stolen from the continent from different tribes and nations. brought across an ocean to a continent we'd never been to before, and morphed into a new people, enslaved. And then after slavery, nobody said, hey, you guys aren't from here. You didn't want to be here. Do you still want to be here? Or how would you like to determine your own future? We were simply incorporated into the structure of the United States as second-class citizens. And this has been a struggle we've been waging ever since. And so we as Black people, alongside our indigenous family, are two of the first victims of the empire of the United States. And this empire, its wealth, its land, its resources can only exist at our expense. So I want to be very clear that when I align the Black struggle for liberation with the Palestinian struggle, it is because they each are struggles for self-determination against European colonialism and against imperialism. And that if we need to be very clear that this country is an active colony. And so those of us who are not indigenous and those of us who were not brought here against our will and given no other choice are contributing to, if not actively, then passively, a form of colonization and as settlers. I might come back to this later, but this is just a kind of helpful guide I found at a conference in Detroit a few years ago that looks at how white supremacy operates in the US. So one pillar of this is the enslavement of Africans and their subsequent exploitation and containment. Another pillar is indigenous genocide and land theft, which not only includes all of this continent, but also Hawaii, Puerto Rico, Guam, the American Samoa, Marshall Islands, and other territories. And that these are two of the pillars that uphold white supremacy here. The third being kind of xenophobia, the exploitation of immigrants who are not Black or indigenous, as well as waging war against the countries where these immigrants come from, whether economic or actual physical war. So in order to really seize this moment, we have to, I think I'm going to guess that most of us here are not individual racists towards Black people, that we care for our freedom and liberation, that we think racism is bad. That's great, but we need a lot more than just opposing racism. We actually need material and relational investment in Black communities and in Black struggle. And I'd like to share a video example of what this type of organizing, Black organizing for self-determination looks like, specifically in Detroit. Let me just make sure that my audio is going to go through.
Where we are right now is called Freedom Growers, and it is the organization of Wayne and Myrtle Curtis. We're on the east side of Detroit, and as you can see behind me, there's a lot of gardening that's going on.
We started to realize how it related to our autonomy, how it related to understanding our biological existence.
In this garden, there's opportunity not only to feed themselves and for people in the neighborhood to feed themselves from the garden if they work the garden and help, but it's also an opportunity to come together with the garden. And one of the things that's really special about this area is it's not too far from what's called Grosse Pointe, Michigan. It's about 1.5 miles away, which is one of the richest places in Michigan, if not the country. And people are moving into this area because it's close to the river, and a lot of people being displaced.
They're restructuring, rezoning, bringing in new financial institutions, governments changing. So how does that affect us? Foreclosures.
We're trying to figure out how we can be supportive of people to stay in their homes and continue to live with their families like they always have. One of the neighbors almost lost her house, and it was a 2-year effort in this very garden where hundreds of people gathered to resist the takeover of the home.
She won because of the support of the neighborhood.
That is going on all over the city. People, the thing that I really love about Detroit is what I call Detroit spirit, and that's the spirit of determination.
So I wanted to bring this up for a few reasons. One, it's just like, it's literally one of dozens of reasons why Detroit is the best city in this country, because there's so many brilliant and creative and visionary Black organizers and other organizers that are just working to create an entirely different and better world. And a large part of that focuses on land and food justice. And I want to stress that access to each of these things is a very core component of the right to ability to determine your own future as a people. Um, if you don't have access to land, or if you don't control or have the ability to control your access to food, that means that somebody else can control you. And so for the context of Black folks in this country, we can't say that we've had self-determination. And in the context of Palestine, that is a right that has been stripped away from them. Palestinians were largely in agricultural and what's the other word? Not just like making produce, but like shepherds, pastoral maybe. Community that was, and most of the region was able to subsist, if not on what it could produce within a village, then at least to produce within the village and trade with another village in order to sustain themselves. And this is an ability, a freedom actually, that has been stripped away by the occupation. But another point I want to highlight here is that we can consider gentrification as a form of the legacy of colonialism today. So Black folks in Detroit might not be indigenous to the land, but we have struggled and suffered deeply on that territory, and are now being pushed out by the interest of developers or largely white folks with material access to wealth. Similarly, in Jerusalem, which is a very contested city, there has been an intentional effort on the part of the state of Israel to remove as many Palestinians from Jerusalem as possible in order to Judaize the city. So if you go to study abroad in the US and can't prove that you lived at your home in Jerusalem for a certain amount of time, they'll strip away your residency. As one example of trying to change the demographics so that Israelis are a majority in the city. But gentrification is something that we actively need to oppose in both cities. And so what I offer as a form of being in solidarity with our struggle in a deeper way is to spend time volunteering in places like Detroit, or with Black organizations that are doing strong work on the ground, and not just kind of the well-known organizations. Okay, we don't need that again. Another way of being in solidarity with our struggle and just in general is to de-exceptionalize Palestine and Israel. Palestine is not the most oppressed place in the world. Israel is not the most oppressive state in the world. The conditions of struggle and oppression are actually not unique on a historical scale. They're variations of a history that colonized people and colonizers have been enacting in multiple places and spaces over centuries. And so we need to understand that we have to look at the full picture and support the struggle and liberation of all people struggling under colonialism and imperialism and racism in order to be free. Another point that's really important to understand is that justice for Black folks cannot be US centric. We live in the US, but Black folks, specifically from the slave trade, wound up all across the Americas. And Brazil actually has the highest percentage of the African diaspora outside of the continent. And from Brazil to Colombia to the West Caribbean to the US, Black people are struggling largely under very similar conditions of exploitation, of poverty and racism and police violence. So again, these struggles have to be global. And finally, just thinking about politics of abolition. I don't know how many of you were paying attention to abolition before last year, but we really need to understand that, I don't know, these structures and systems that are set up were set up to oppress Black and Indigenous folks. And I wanted, what I mean by that is the very first police forces in this country were founded as slave patrols to catch runaway slaves and to protect the settlements of Europeans from Indigenous people who were seeking to reclaim access to their stolen land. And so when we look at the function of the police, it's to protect areas of wealth or privilege, which are largely inhabited by white folks, from those who are oppressed and get the short end of the stick in this country. And so I just want to pull up something that you can read more about in this article, but it's really understanding that we need abolition in both contexts, here in the US and in Palestine. So I wrote this article specifically directed at Palestinian solidarity activists who largely understand that the occupation is wrong, that Israeli prisons are illegal, that settlements are illegal, and that the military there is a system, maintaining a system of ethnic supremacy. But for folks who are less familiar with that context, what I want you to understand is, on a global level, the United States and Israel are the police of the world. They enact or build up the prisons of the world, and they keep oppressed populations, not just within their borders, but around the world oppressed. We can talk about the United States and its role in drone bombing and killing thousands of civilians across the Middle East and Africa. We can talk about Israel exporting weapons that it tests on the Palestinians it kills in Gaza, and then exports to repressive regimes around the world. We can talk about Israel and the US each propping up the apartheid South Africa regime, all the way until its fall in the late 80s, early 90s, rather than standing on the side of justice and freedom against racial oppression. But it really boils down to that each of these countries and their institutions exist to protect land that was stolen, and to protect the beneficiaries of that colonization from the colonized populations. So we have to envision just structures that get us out of war, of murder, and of the oppression of indigenous and marginalized populations. So I want to close by sharing a video from my time in Lebanon. And just to give a little bit of context, because I view Palestinian refugees and their ability to return home as a core component of justice for Palestine, and this is the position of Black for Palestine as well, we thought it was important to engage with Palestinians who have been living in exile outside of Palestine for the last 70 years. And so there are Palestinian refugees living in refugee camps across Lebanon, Jordan, Syria, and even internally within the West Bank and Gaza Strip, who are all originally from places like Haifa or Akka or Nazareth in what is now Israel. And so Palestinians in Lebanon are treated as second-class citizens. The Lebanese government forbids them from holding over, I think, 30 different professions, like doctors, lawyers, and engineers, which forces them into a position of forced poverty, and of being insecure in terms of employment. And so with Black for Palestine, I visited the Palestinian camps in Lebanon quite a few times over the last few years. And this is just one video explaining why both I am there, but also the message that I give to Palestinians about the need for Africans and Palestinians to stand together. Thank you for coming. My name is Christian Bailey. I'm coming from the United States, and I'm the founder of a group called Black for Palestine. So I'm here in Badawi camp in Lebanon because our organization understands that all of Palestine is Palestine, And that central to that is the return of all refugees to their homelands in occupied Palestine. What I see in the camps is very similar to how white American society views black neighborhoods in the US, where a lot of us are very poor and don't have the resources we need to survive. And because of that, the outside society sees us as dangerous or as criminals or as threats. And that's the same thing I hear the Lebanese say about the Palestinians in the camps here. The reason we exist in camps, or the reason that we exist under racism in the US, for example, is because our colonizers still have power. And so it's up to us to be able to take that power from the colonizers to build the community and the life that we need to have to survive. They're speaking in Arabic here, so I'll just explain briefly. But over the course of meeting and working with youth in a center in the camps, they went from knowing nothing about the Black struggle or South Africa or broader things to caring about it very deeply. And so these are two brothers who made some pieces responding to the question, what does it look like for Africans and Palestinians to be in solidarity with each other? So this is Muhammad's drawing, and I think you'll see his brother's drawing momentarily. His brother was a huge Beyonce fan. And then this is another one of the youth in the camps who, again, just knew nothing about our history or struggle. But from the onset of hearing about what Black folks have faced for centuries in the United States, said, how or why can anybody treat you this way? So I think the importance of Africans and Palestinians working together is that when we rise up and when we fight for our rights and achieve our rights, it has ripple effects all around the world. So the Palestinian movement or revolution is central to justice for the entire Arab world. And Black people and Africans, both in the US and on the continent, rising up for ourselves and obtaining our rights also has repercussions for colonized people all around the world. So each of us need to be strong in order for the world to be free. So yeah, I just want to close on a few points, and that's really understanding that each of these struggles is part of a broader struggle for reparations and repair for colonialism. How can I get out of this? That these struggles have been going on, for decades. Here is the Black Panthers meeting with the Palestinian Liberation Organization in Algeria in 1969, as well as Huey Newton in a Palestinian refugee camp in Lebanon in 1980. We can talk more about that in the Q&A if you want. But understanding that the same reason that Israel does not want to allow Palestinians to return back to their homes is the same reason why Africans and other colonized people have not received reparations for colonialism. It is that once one colonial power admits its guilt and the harm it's committed against other people and atones for it materially, it opens up every other colonial power to the same thing. France for indebting Haiti for freeing itself from slavery. Spain for the harm it wreaked upon the world with the Spanish Empire, both in the Americas and in the Pacific. Britain, the UK, Germany, the United States, all of these countries have a vested interest in preventing any form of anything close to liberation or decolonization for oppressed people. And so it's why it's our responsibility even more to push for those causes and those policies wherever and however we can. So I'm really grateful to have spoken with you today, specifically understanding the just very rich legacy and history that Michigan State had in the movement against apartheid South Africa. And just want to share these posters and buttons to show that the struggle might look different across different times and places, but ultimately the struggle continues, and you all are part of the legacy of fighting against that. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Christian, for speaking. Sorry. Sorry, he's being bad. Did anybody have any questions for Christian before we start questions? Okay, so that's a reaction. Okay. So we had a couple of questions for you all, and we're giving out some gift cards as well. So my first question is, after hearing everything, what similarities do you all see between Black and Palestinian people? And whoever wants to answer can jump in, or you can raise your hands in the chat feature.
One of the similarities I see definitely is that like one of the biggest connections is like police, and that how they're all kind of like interconnected with their training. Like learning how some police departments in the United States will have Israeli officers, or some training program where they learn techniques from Israeli the police. And so I feel like that in of itself shows such a drastic connection with how Palestinians are treated, and then how Black people are treated. And just there by the training each police force has is gonna have that connection with us.
Yeah, so I remember actually going to a SUPR event like maybe my sophomore year or something, and it was like a part of their Deadly Exchange series that I believe, and just learning about the training that US gets from Israel, or Israel gets from the US. I don't know how it went, but basically like one trains the other. Jamie, I don't know if you can go more into that.
Sorry, my computer wasn't unmuting. Can you say that again?
Yeah, so I was just talking about the event that you guys did, basically talking about how the police in the US are trained by the Israeli military, and like how that relationship works.
Yeah, so we've had multiple events covering this topic. We had one with Black Girls Unite at MSU, and then one in collaboration with a couple other Palestinian sovereignty organizations across Southeast Michigan. And basically, we think it's really important to touch on as much as we can, because the connection between militarization in America and in Palestine is directly related, in that they prop each other up, and as technology increases, both forces increase their militarization and their brutality. So we kind of go into more detail every single time we have those events, talk more specifically on the specific tactics that they're trading, and you can see actually our last event where we talked about that at our YouTube channel, which I just realized I never put in the chat, but I will do that now if you are interested in learning more. But it's called The Deadly Exchange is what it's been titled. And actually, Christian, if you want to expand maybe a little bit on that.
Sure. You reminded me I had things to put in the chat too, so I'll do that simultaneously. Yeah, so I think one thing that's important to understand about these police exchanges or trainings is that each group on its own is already doing a good job at oppressing populations where they live. Even before US police went to Israel, police here were oppressing and harming and killing Black folks. So one thing that I've heard some people say is that, oh, look, this police chief was trained by the Israelis, that's why they're being oppressive towards Black people. No, they would be oppressing Black folks regardless of these trainings. But what these trainings allows for is for um, folks who have a deep understanding and are already good at repressing populations living under racial violence and seeking their freedom, is that they can exchange notes and oppress those populations even better. And so it's kind of a mirror of the type of solidarity we're developing on the grassroots level, where on the top-down level, the oppressive forces are trying to work together to fight us.
Thank you for that. And I forgot to ask, did anybody have any comments on Christian's presentation that you guys wanted to say? I see a comment in the chat from Dion saying, I see amongst us and Palestinian people, land were both taken from us and Palestinian people. And to piggyback off what Christian said, I found it interesting how there is a divide as well. Okay. I definitely agree. And then I was just gonna say, like, I've also been to Israel and Palestine. So Christian, if you want to talk about that, please. And I have some comments as well.
Sure. Yeah. So I have been to Palestine twice. First on a delegation to visit people fighting against the occupation in 2013. And the second time was to speak at a conference at Birzeit University in the West Bank about Black Lives Matter and its support for Palestinian freedom. However, I was arrested by the Israelis while attempting to enter Palestine to speak at this conference, was falsely accused of smuggling ISIS-affiliated drugs into the country, arrested at the border, put in handcuffs and ankle cuffs, put in the back seat of a military jeep with 2 soldiers on each of my sides with military-grade weapons that were probably made in the US, taken to a police station in an illegal settlement outside of Jerusalem, investigated without having access to a lawyer, which was a violation of Israeli law, and then placed in the Russian prison in Jerusalem for a night until I was released on bail after a court hearing the next day. And I say all of this to say that it was very clear that nobody believed that I, a Black American who went to Stanford and is queer, was peddling drugs for ISIS into Israel or Palestine. This was clearly a pretext to prevent me from speaking at the conference and to try to scare me away from my advocacy. And I did miss the conference because I was in jail. But this is also to share how for my friends who were college students that were imprisoned and held on equally inane kind of reasons, this is something that happens on a daily basis for Palestinians. And so, like, I'm aware that there are kind of these propaganda trips that pro-Israel groups try to bring student leaders on, whether student government leaders, or there's been a specific push towards bringing Black student leaders to visit Israel in recent years, because they see how more and more campuses are supporting the investment, and they see how more and more Black folks are supporting Palestine. And we saw this happen at Stanford even. We announced that we would be bringing a divestment resolution in maybe October or November for the following February. Over winter break, one of these organizations, I think the David Project, had paid for one of our student senators to go on a propaganda trip to Israel, who then came back and voted against our resolution in favor of divesting from Palestinian oppression. And so I want to be very clear that there is a huge structural difference in the side of Palestinians and Israelis. Palestinians do not have the money to fly in people to look at how oppressed they are. But I guarantee you that if you spent 10 minutes in a refugee camp in Lebanon, you would have no illusions about the so-called conflict or the issue. But these trips it's not to say that there are not and cannot be good things about Israel or Israeli society or the US or American society, but it is to say that these trips are the equivalent of trying to take Black folks to visit the nicest parts of South Africa during apartheid, to kind of push the more extreme forms of violence to the periphery and say, oh, look, like Black folks have jobs here and they have good health care. If you like support divestment from us, you're going to harm those Black people. And look how advanced we are in South Africa. Or it's the equivalent of taking someone to the south of the U.S. in the segregation and saying, "Oh, what you're hearing is not that bad. Actually, it's the kind of the wrong message. Like, look at this instead." So I don't know if any of you in this call have been approached about these trips or even gone on them, but I really want to stress and ask you that you do not become a tool in somebody else's kind of propaganda project.
Yeah, so I would say to that, like I've been to Israel, like with JSU and the David Project, and I really enjoyed my time there. Um, I've seen things like from both sides, but I would say that we got to see a lot more of Israel than we did of like Palestine. And then like talking about the like occupation and stuff like that, it was very tense. And I know like the day that we did visit Palestine, it was kind of like we could only stay within these parameters. We couldn't go explore over here because of this. Like we had to be back at this strict time and just a lot of different things. And that made me more curious to come back and learn more about Palestine when I came back from Israel. But being pro-Israel doesn't mean anti-Palestine, or being pro-Palestine doesn't mean anti-Israel. Like it's a lot of people want it to be black and white, you know, and that's like being pro-black doesn't mean you're anti-white, and being I don't know what being pro-white means, so I'm not even gonna say that. Um, but yeah, so I definitely think that people think it's black and white when it's really like a lot of gray area, and that's just like with everything in this world. But I will say that if I had not came back and learned more about the Israeli Palestinian conflict from the eyes of Palestinian people, then I probably would have a different view. So I would say, like, I encourage going on these trips just for the experience, but I will also say, oh, with everything, like, do your own research, because people can do the same thing in America. They can take you to the best places, take you to the suburbs of Detroit. When people see Detroit now, where do they go? Downtown. Why is that? Because that's the gentrified area. They don't take you to the east side where I'm from and see how the citizens of Detroit are really having to live now, and how they can't go past 8 Mile to the suburbs because they might get pulled over and arrested. So it's just different things like that, you know. But Dion has some questions in the chat. Um, he said, "What are some differences you've seen between the two nations? Do you feel as though this country is any better than Israel? And what are some initiatives or things we could do to help change the lawmaking and protesting rights in Israel?"
Damn it, I went so long without speaking while being muted, and yeah, I still get mad that it's something that I do this far into being on Zoom all the time. Um, but what I was gonna say is there are like individual differences in the specific histories of these places. But I largely look at Israel and the US as being on a continuum. So where we are in the US right now is where Israel might be in 200 or 300 years if it continues on the same trajectory. Maybe the core issue of the occupation has died down or gone away, but Palestinians would still be kind of second-class citizens struggling for rights and self-determination in their own land. Um, Similarly, I imagine that just some of the more visceral acts of violence that we see happening through Israel's occupation um, are what the original kind of settlement of this territory looked like against indigenous populations. So it's a larger point, but I'm not going to say one is better or worse. I will say that each promises or gives the presentation of being a democracy, but the so-called democracies in which each of them rest really rely on and cannot exist without the oppression of other people. So is that even a democracy? And that's kind of one of the bigger points of this moment, both for Black Lives Matter and for Palestine, is grappling with just the legacies of these forms of violence and racism against our people, but also understanding that it's not enough just to acknowledge that there's racism or that there's privilege, but what is needed to repair it in the coming period is actually just material reparations. It's giving up access to social power, to wealth that is rooted in exploiting other people, and even to land, giving land back to the indigenous populations that it was stolen from. So these are all things that I hope that we can kind of facilitate in calling for and enacting.
Can I ask a quick question? It's great. It's great to hear you talk and to see your face. I know the work that you've done in Palestine Legal's work. I've actually had some support from Palestine Legal in the past when I've been attacked on Twitter by Canary Mission people, and so I appreciate that. But you know, one of the things that comes back, and I've been talking to Jamie and some of the other students involved with SUPR at MSU. I'm the faculty advisor. Is just the way that in the 70s and 80s, even at the UN, there was like Zionism was equated with a form of racism. There was a UN General Assembly resolution equating Zionism and racism, and now any criticism of Zionism comes under attack as a form of anti-Semitism. Now that was always there, but like we're kind of losing the rhetorical battle, at least in the US, and I would say in Europe as well, in France and Britain also, where it's very difficult to find a language to critique Israel or advocate for Palestinian rights without being really subject to that kind of demonization, which is exactly what Canary Mission does. And it's especially effective in silencing anti-Zionist Jews and pro-Palestinian Arabs and Muslims, especially young people. So I'm wondering if in the, because your position I think speaks really directly to activists who are in many ways, you know, Black Lives Matter activists or Indigenous rights activists. So people who are already kind of engaged on these issues, but getting to people who, you know, who might be, oh, those poor Palestinians, but you know, they don't want to say anything because they're worried about being accused of being anti-Semitic. So how do you talk about this issue in those audiences?
And just sorry, can you clarify that last part of your question? You're asking.
So like, I want you to sort of, if you could, if there's like a language developing, like in you know, among people within, you know, who are like dealing with this at the level of sort of court cases that want to challenge the legal definition of anti-Semitism to include any critique of Zionism. Like, is there any, like, what is the argument that we make to people who are maybe somewhat, like, there's a lot of mainstream Democrats who consider Israel to be belligerent in the occupation, but they're never going to say anything because they're afraid of being accused of being anti-Semitic. So what's the language? And this is probably true, I'm sure, for a lot of Black people in the US who sort of want to steer clear of that issue, because even though they might support Black Lives Matter, they don't want to, they're worried about tainting Black Lives Matter with accusations of Middle East terrorism or something like that. So I'm just wondering, like, what kind of arguments are being made to people who are maybe sympathetic but not willing to take a position because they're afraid of being accused of being anti-Semitic?
Yeah. Okay. Thank you for that clarification. And just to give brief context, so there's been a big push over the last 15-ish years to define different aspects of Palestine advocacy or criticism of Israel as anti-Semitic. And it's really taken off over the last 5 years or so. So Trump signed an executive order 2 years ago adopting this definition on the federal level. And under that definition, saying things like Israel is a racist endeavor, or even having a human rights investigation into Israel can be that's anti-Semitic under this definition. This obviously is a violation of First Amendment protected speech, but it's meant to kind of distract and silence both activists who are already speaking and to scare off people who might be sympathetic but don't want to wade in, as the professor was just alluding to. And um, and my answer is that we really have to have a values-based approach in how we talk about these issues. And so if I, for example, say that Israel is a racist endeavor, I'm not saying that to be mean. I'm not saying that to be trite. I'm saying that because the simple value of allowing someone to live in a territory solely based on their ethnicity is racism, especially if you're excluding people who are from that land. And so I think there's ways to kind of talk about the issue in terms of values that make more sense to everyday people. How would you feel if the land where your grandmother was from, when she was a girl, somebody came and kicked her off of it and said, you and your family can never come back here? What would you do, or how would you kind of approach that situation? Or to tie it into, and this is what we did at Stanford, relate it to issues that people have more familiarity with. So if we can understand why we wouldn't want to invest in prisons or deportation, we also don't want to be investing in those things abroad in Palestine or anywhere. Yeah, so I think it's really just understanding that there's solidarity in our communities coming together, and that there's a huge movement of Palestinians, of Arabs, of progressive Jewish people, of others against this redefinition of anti-Semitism, who understand that it's being used to silence kind of political movements. But I'll admit, it's not easy to speak up. I was made aware before this talk that a group on campus thought that I shouldn't be speaking because I have allegedly incited violence against a certain community, which is something that I have never done, and it's something that they could not kind of back up when asked. But these are the accusations that come up when you try to speak up. And yeah, I'll just say it isn't easy. I was very anxious before this talk. I've been waiting for somebody to come out of the woodworks with a surprise question that catches me off guard, and aha, we got you. Yeah, you're actually like full of hate, not somebody that is cares about freedom and justice for people, struggling people around the world. But I know what my values are. I know that I stand in a rich legacy of support for freedom of people across the Americas, across Africa, across Asia and the Middle East. And I know what our communities and our movements are about. So I think it's really just standing strong in the values and politics and movements that we have is how we push through the kind of backlash.
Thanks. There's a interesting chat going on. I don't know if you can see it.
No, I'm just.
It's sort of related to questions that came up earlier about policing. So maybe you want to. But thanks for that.
Mm-hmm. Does our Kasama talking about the Philippines want to say a little bit?
Thank you, Kasama and Chrissy. Christian. So, yeah, I guess like I guess like I mentioned, like yeah, like they're like it's when you include like the Philippines in this, it's sort of like triangular, as in you have Netanyahu like supporting, like the Philippine government's like wars against the people. Like most recently, they passed an anti-terrorism law which like enables people to like basically be like um arrested without like warrant and whatever just because they are quote unquote supporting terrorism. It's sort of like I guess like like again very similar to what's going on with like Palestinian like activists and stuff like that, and like Palestinian people in general, like in the occupied territories. And at the same time, like the Biden like I guess like administration will probably make things a little more interesting. We have to see more, but at least during the Trump years, like there was also a lot of like again like I think $20 billion going towards like the Philippines in terms of monetary aid and stuff like that, and and of course there's like a lot of like trainings that the Philippine government does with like American cops and stuff like that. So like, and at the same time, like I mentioned, like Philippine senators were also like vilifying um, Black Lives Matter as a terrorist movement at the same time while they were criticizing legal Philippine movements for being quote unquote terrorist orgs as well, despite the government making a situation where the Philippines is like one of the most dangerous like countries for environmental activists. Like the rabbit hole goes deeper, but Philippines is part of this sort of like whole thing too.
I really appreciate that. And my general encouragement for everybody is make the shape bigger and bigger. It's not just about Black liberation or Palestine. Try adding another struggle and place into it and see what the connections or relations are to those places, and then add a fourth place to that, and then a fifth. And what becomes clear the more and more wider view that we take, one is that the US and Israel are not on the side of people struggling for freedom. In fact, they have quite actively contributed to the stifling of movements against colonialism across Africa, across Latin America, across Asia. And that these alliances continue through today. And so it's really important for us to understand that it's people power, it's connecting the grassroots across borders and across struggles. That's the only way that any of us gets free.
I think I wanted to ask one last question since we are a little bit over time and we want to respect everyone's time. So feel free to go if you are busy. And thank you, Jonathan, for adding that to the conversation. But I wanted to ask, since both SUPR and BSA are such important like student organizations on our campuses and have so much power because of our position within the institution, what kind of like unique actions do you think we can take as students within the institution of Michigan State due to our position here?
I mean, if I may. Oh, sorry, I tried to lower my hand and I muted myself back. Lord Jesus, have mercy. But, because with the two organizations, at least where I say I see potential, right? Because there's always potential in it, unless we back it up with our actions, right? I feel as though that BSA and SUPR both independently and collaboratively can form infrastructure. And let me explain. Because the thing with these two important groups, which I find a lot of promise in, is that we always have the drive and the fire, and we have the ideas. We may have we have our reasons for coming in and wanting to make a change, which is step one. But I feel as though really like we take actions further once we start thinking farther. You know what I mean? Because I'll quote my professor Etienne Charles, a prolific jazz trumpet player from Trinidad. Activism is fun and games until people start asking for money, until people start asking for the things that are really important. Because while we are trying to make this a more inclusive space, being inclusive should never be a goal. It should be a right. It should be something that is already here. So with that, seeing that we have the Black Student Association and that we have SUPR, I really believe that we can form infrastructure to make sure that our kids are not just comfortable, but make sure that they can succeed at the same rates and have the same possibilities as our, non-melanated or Caucasian counterparts. Because it's not just about comfort, it's about, well, what are the education disparities? What are the financial disparities? What are the food disparities? Why isn't there really a scholarship for Black students, let's say, based off of the first Black students that came to Michigan State? Or vice versa with other people of color, LGBTQ plus, and however more we decide to add to the picture. And I think the sooner that we start thinking about it and the sooner that we form an infrastructure, not to say that it competes with the system, but it creates that platform that we look for, that equity, that seems to be the vocabulary word in every university, in every DEIB training, in every place that I've seen nowadays. Once we actually form equity, then we can start, pushing our people. And when I say our people, I don't mean just Black. I mean everybody who has been oppressed historically, systemically, in every way, shape, or form. We could truly start pushing our people forward.
Thank you for that. And yeah, I don't have much to add. It's just if you dream it, you can do it. And I really want you all to understand that as students in an institution, you have an immense amount of power. I don't know how many of you have seen, there's a documentary called Have You Heard from Johannesburg, that looks at the movement against apartheid in South Africa. And there's just some really great clips of like thousands of students I mean, we can't do this now, but like thousands of students occupying their campus and administrative buildings, demanding divestment. Just a very huge and robust solidarity movement. Movements that were connecting not only what's happening abroad, but also how the university relates to the communities around it and the struggling communities around it. There's so much richness that can happen on campus. And so I think my biggest piece of advice is just stressing the importance of coalition building and relationship building with your allies across campus, of building campaigns that really anybody can plug into. So divestment for Palestine, that's not the only divestment issue. There's like prisons, there's the police system, there's fossil fuels. There's so much that you all as students can do if you manage to come together across struggles. And I really just want to lift up what you said about our people. It doesn't just mean Black or Palestinian or what. Our people are all the people who are struggling for freedom and for liberation. And you're lucky that, yes, thank you for whoever put that. You're at a public institution, so you can see exactly what your investments are. We couldn't do that at my school.
Yeah, and most of them are connected companies, so fighting for one is fighting for all of them. But thank you all so much for going so long after our event was supposed to end. And thank you so much, Christian, for your wisdom as always. I'm so excited to keep building coalition with you all, and have a good night.
Yeah, thank you everybody for coming. BSA is having 2 more events in our Black Love Week. So please stay tuned. Christian, we appreciate you so much. Hopefully we can get you to come to campus again. And yeah, everybody have a good night and stay tuned for the rest of the week.